orphans were places where doctors went to do experiments.
So, as far as I'm concerned, I'm scared as a black man in America, but you said most of the prison population was white folks back then?
Initially, back in the 50s, these experiments were performed on whites. In fact, you have cases at some prisons where black prisoners felt that they were being segregated, that they were not being treated equally.
Please take me. I want you to put ram balls on me, please.
It wasn't so much that they wanted to advance science. In many cases, these inmates wanted the money. In Philadelphia, there was not one prisoner that I interviewed who said that he volunteered for an experiment because he wanted to advance science, or he wanted to show his patriotism, or he was altruistic. They did it because they were in need of money, and this was the only way to make it. And the Holmesburg situation is very much the flip side of Tuskegee. In Tuskegee, you had 400 black men who were sick and left untreated. In Holmesburg, you have hundreds, in fact, thousands of men who were basically healthy, who then went into the experiments and were made ill.
Why did you pick Holmesburg as opposed to Atlanta or some of the others? I mean, from your book, you enumerated several different prisons in the Midwest, on the left coast, down south, but why did you pick...
I have a long chapter. The third chapter of the book is basically the history of human experimentation in American prisons. And it talks about the cases whereby prisoners in Virginia were used for flash burn studies. Prisoners in Ohio were used for polio and cancer studies. Prisoners in Oregon and Washington were used for testicular radiation studies. It goes on all across the country. The reason why I focused on Philly is because that's my hometown. Those are the experiments that I witnessed. Those are the experiments that basically seared my soul. And I recognized something was wrong about that. And if somebody else had, ventured into it and done the research, I would have read it and been satisfied. But since no one else had done it, I was crazy enough to launch myself into a 5-year crusade, give up my job, nearly go broke. But, I think I answered the story pretty well as to what happened, why it took place, why it was allowed to take place, and why we have to be ever vigilant that something like that never happens again.
Let's get into mind control, LSD, and those kinds of experiments.
Right.
What's your knowledge about those kinds of experiments on these prisoners?
Well, what happened in Philadelphia is this. The story goes back to Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. That's on the military base at Aberdeen Proving Grounds. The Edgewater section of that base is where the Army has its chemical warfare unit. For years, if not decades, the Army, as well as the CIA, had been looking for some incapacitant, some sort of magic bullet to create the Manchurian Candidate. Not only to wipe out an enemy with chemicals, but also to come up with a magic bullet that could be given to somebody that we would give an order to, and that person would go out and do it even though he knew it to be wrong, ethically or injurious to him or whatever. So experiments are taking place down at Edgewood Arsenal, and LSD is the chemical that they're spending lots of time and millions of dollars with. However, by 62, 63, they really recognize that LSD is just too unstable a property, and once they give it to somebody, they really can't control that individual. So they start looking at other drugs, other pharmaceutical combinations, such as atropine, scopolamine, benzolates, belladonnoids, and they're giving these to the soldiers. However, the soldiers are ending up incapacitated for an extended period of time. In some cases it's days, but in other cases it's weeks. Now that's a small base in operation they have, so the military decides they need to branch out. They need another site to do their testing. Where do they come? They come to Philly. Not because we have great soft pretzels, not because we had Norman Van Brocklin throwing touchdown passes at Tommy McDonald. They came to Philly because we had Dr. Kligman, the University of Pennsylvania and Holmesburg Prison.
That's Dr. Albert Kligman?
That is correct.
The dermatologist that came up with...
Retin-A.
Retin-A.
Right. Right. He was the one who was doing these experiments. He had developed a reputation around the country, not only for dermatology, but in the field of human experimentation. If you, Brother R.A., and some friends wanted to go out and test something on somebody, you wouldn't do it in Boston. You'd probably come to Philly. People from Michigan came to Philly. People from Maryland, the CIA came, in North Carolina to
Pfizer, Merck, Sharp and Dome.
Right. All of the big chemical companies knew of Dr. Kligman and Holmesburg. So the Army did the same thing. They contacted him. They asked if he'd be interested in helping them with experiments. He, of course, said yes, especially when he heard that he was going to be paid handsomely. And from 1963 to the early 70s, hundreds of Philly prisoners were used in experiments on various chemical warfare agents, all sorts of incapacitants, and they even did some skin hardening experiments. So they were
What kind of experiments?
Skin hardening. The military was very concerned about fighting an enemy such as Saddam Hussein, who had his own chemical weapons, and the military was trying to turn the skin of an individual into a laminated tabletop, so that even though somebody may be sprayed with a foreign chemical, it would not penetrate the skin, that it could just be brushed off the way it would off a laminated tabletop. So Kligman would have dozens of prisoners, mostly black at that point, with their arms in pails of water with different combinations of very powerful potions in there, such as benzene, nickel, sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid, and it got so bad and it was so painful that a number of the African-American prisoners protested and said they were going to shut down the whole thing if Kligman didn't stop those particular experiments. But the one that really developed a bad reputation in the minds of the prisoners were those chemical warfare studies, because many of these men were being injected with various drugs running from cannabis and marijuana to very strong dosages of atropine, scopolamine, belladonnoids that left these men delirious for days, in some cases weeks. A guy would see a bug or a roach on the floor, and he would think it was a rhinoceros. They would see something, on the ceiling, a spider, and they would think it was some sort of prehistoric animal coming to eat them.
And now we have ecstasy.
Well, some people have it. I don't think I have it here in Philly. But they were doing everything in the prisons back then. All you had to be was somebody who had the money to back up your particular protocol, and Kligman would probably do business with you, even if it had nothing to do with his field of expertise, which was dermatology. The Army experiments were chemical warfare agents, mind-control drugs. Kligman had no expertise in that area, but of course he did it. He was also injecting prisoners with radioactive isotopes. He was also doing experiments for Dow Chemical, where he was applying dioxin, one of the most powerful carcinogenic agents known. He was doing those experiments back in the mid-'60s for Dow Chemical Company.
Can you go ahead and list some of the companies that you uncovered that utilized Kligman and the prisoners to test their particular products for market?